When I listened to African leaders, I was disappointed. We are the only continent in the world that still goes to the slave master to ask the slave master, how can we be better in freedom? As I talk to you now, Africa.
They say the world's great powers gather at polished tables to decide humanity's future. And yet, when Africa finally found itself mentioned inside the G20 halls in South Africa, something was painfully obvious. The continent of 1.4 billion people was present only in name, not in influence. At that same moment in Luanda, Angola, European and African leaders sat in another grand conference room, trading speeches about cooperation and shared progress. But beneath the surface, something colder was happening. Africa was still approaching the very powers that once dominated it, still asking the old masters how to become free. For many older Americans watching from afar, this may stir a familiar memory, the moment a nation must choose whether to remain dependent or to become sovereign, once and for all. As the cameras moved from the G20 panels to the streets of the continent, a harsher truth came into view. In Sudan, families fleeing bombed-out neighborhoods could not even celebrate a national anniversary. In southern Cameroon, children have not set foot in a classroom for more than 3 years. In the Central African Republic and Eastern Congo, communities are trapped between armed groups and hunger. The speaker at the University of Ilorin said it plainly, Africa is at a crossroads. Africa is crumbling. And yet, in a quiet corner of Nigeria, a 50-year-old university stood tall, thriving, expanding, and proving that African excellence is not a dream, but a living, breathing reality. It is here in this improbable contrast between crisis and possibility that the real question emerges: will African nations finally reclaim the authority to shape their own destiny, or will they continue asking others for permission to rise? For those who still believe Africa deserves better, this moment matters deeply. If you care about sovereignty, if you follow leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, if you believe Africa is writing a new chapter the world must pay attention to, please stay with us. Share this video if you want more people to see the truth behind the headlines. Subscribe if you believe that Africa's story should finally be told by Africans themselves. When the speaker at the University of Ilorin began his address, he did not start with celebration. Instead, he began with a warning, a striking image meant to ground the audience in reality before lifting their hopes. He spoke of South Africa hosting the G20, a gathering of the world's most powerful economies, and yet Africa's presence there felt more symbolic than substantive. Cameras showed African delegates, but the decisions being made carried little of Africa's imprint. It was a moment that revealed something many older Americans have long recognized in global politics: visibility is not the same as influence. At the very same time in Luanda, Angola, the European Union and African Union held their own high-profile meeting. The speeches were polished, the promises familiar. But behind the diplomatic smiles, the speaker sensed a painful paradox. African leaders were still seeking guidance from the very powers that once dictated their fate. We remain, he said, the only continent that returns to the slave master to ask how we can be freer. It was a line that stung not because it was harsh, but because it echoed a truth many Africans feel, yet rarely say out loud. From that global stage, he pivoted sharply to the brutal reality unfolding across the continent. His voice carried the urgency of a man describing a house on fire. In Sudan, he reminded the audience families are unable to celebrate an anniversary at all. They are too busy running for their lives. The country is drowning in what humanitarian experts now call the worst crisis on earth. In the Central African Republic, instability remains constant. In southern Cameroon, children have been locked out of their classrooms for more than 3 years. And in eastern Congo, violence has become a rhythm of daily life. Africa is at a crossroads, he repeated. Africa is crumbling. For the elders in the room, the weight of those words was not theoretical. Many had lived through coups, currency crashes, and wars. They understood the warning. But then, with deliberate contrast, he brought the audience back to where they were sitting, the University of Ilorin, Nigeria, a campus so large that it takes 5 kilometers to drive from the gate to the vice-chancellor's office. A university that began with barely 500 students and now welcomes more than 50,000. In a continent where so many institutions struggle to grow, Ilorin had become a giant rising quietly while the world looked elsewhere. He praised the university not for chasing Western validation, but for building a uniquely African identity. Alumni from Cameroon, Ethiopia, Pakistan, and even Italy had found their way to Ilorin, proof that the university was not merely expanding, it was attracting the world. He mentioned traditional rulers dressed in full regalia, professors who had returned home to teach, and visiting scholars who marveled at Ilorin's reach. To older American viewers, this may feel similar to the pride that once surrounded state universities that built their reputation through service, not prestige rankings. He reminded his audience that Africa had once made grand promises to itself. In 1980, during the Lagos Plan of Action, leaders vowed to strengthen education and trade within the continent. In 1991, at the Abuja Declaration, they committed to allocating 15% of national budgets to healthcare. Decades passed, and those promises remained largely unfulfilled. Meetings continued, declarations multiplied, but implementation lagged far behind. This was why Ilorin mattered. This was why Nigeria mattered. In the speakers telling, Ilorin represented what Africa could be: organized, ambitious, confident, while the crises across the continent represented what Africa still was. The contrast between these two realities was the heart of his message. Africa's future would not be decided at the G20 or in Brussels. It would be decided in places like Ilorin, where minds are shaped, where self-belief is rebuilt, where new generations learn to stop mimicking the world and begin solving problems rooted in African soil. And so the main event of this story was not just a speech. It was a confrontation between the Africa that struggles and the Africa that strives, between the Africa that waits for permission and the Africa that dares to lead. The turning point of the speech arrived quietly, at first almost hidden inside a simple observation. Africans, he said, often believe that what is theirs is inferior. It was not an accusation, but a confession, a truth spoken with the weight of generations behind it. The audience shifted, and even through the screen you could sense a moment of collective discomfort. It was the type of discomfort that precedes awakening. He spoke of languages, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Kiswahili, Amharic tongues that carried centuries of memory, proverbs, and philosophy, yet many African universities barely taught them. Meanwhile, Harvard University, thousands of miles away in the United States, offered courses in those very languages. How, he asked, could a people expect to respect themselves if they did not first respect their own heritage? It was a question that landed heavily the way only truth spoken without anger can. This was the first emotional climax, a call to reclaim dignity. He then spoke of culture, the sight of traditional rulers in their resplendent attire attending the ceremony at Ilorin. To outsiders, they may seem ceremonial, but to Africans, they represent continuity, identity, and memory. He who abandons his culture is a slave, he said, invoking an old African proverb. It was not directed at the West. It was directed inward toward a generation of young Africans who scroll endlessly through foreign platforms but cannot name the stories of their own ancestors. Here, the reaction in the hall changed. People nodded, some applauded, and others simply stared ahead, processing. The atmosphere had shifted from warning to self-recognition. Then came the second climax, stronger and more urgent: Nigeria's responsibility to lead Africa. His tone sharpened. Nigeria was not just another African country, it was the demographic and cultural giant of the continent. 1 out of every 4 Africans is a Nigerian, he reminded them. He listed moments when Nigeria stepped forward and the continent stabilized, supporting the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, restoring peace in Liberia and Sierra Leone through ECOMOG, intervening in the Gambia when political crisis threatened chaos. When Nigeria leads, he said, Africa stabilizes. This was not flattery, it was a challenge. In the audience, Nigerian officials sat upright. Elders nodded, aware that the speaker was stirring something deeper than national pride. He was reminding Nigeria of its lost mantle. From here, the speech accelerated. He painted a vision of an Africa where movement between countries was as natural as traveling between states in America. No visas, no border forms, no colonial-era lines drawn in Berlin in 1884. Just Africans moving freely across the continent that belongs to them. For older Americans who watched Europe unify under the EU, the parallel was unmistakable. But for Africans, it was a dream still frustrated by bureaucracy and political hesitation. He gave a breathtaking image: African breakfast table, cocoa from Ghana, tea from Kenya, meat from Namibia, water from Nigeria, and chicken from Burkina Faso. Not imported brands, not foreign corporations, just Africa feeding Africa. This image lingered like a painting, simple yet revolutionary. And then he turned to the subject most young people recognized instantly: technology. Some of you are on Google, Instagram, WhatsApp. But do you know who controls them, he asked? Someone in the United States can switch them off. The room fell silent. The idea that Africa's digital heartbeat could be controlled from thousands of miles away was a revelation for many. He wasn't blaming America, he was exposing the vulnerability of dependency. And in that vulnerability lay the third climax, the call for technological sovereignty. He challenged the University of Ilorin to be part of a new frontier, not as consumers, but as creators, creating homegrown technology, African-built platforms, digital systems hosted on African soil. It was perhaps the boldest vision of the entire address. By now, the reactions in the room were no longer passive. There were bursts of applause, murmurs of agreement, and the unmistakable energy of a crowd beginning to believe in its own potential. This was the emotional height of the speech, Africa confronting its wounds, recognizing its strength, and daring to imagine a future written by its own hands. The civil and political consequences of this crossroads moment in Africa were not abstract in the speaker's mind. They were real, tangible, and visible in the daily lives of millions. And he made it clear that if Nigeria and institutions like the University of Ilorin failed to rise to the moment, the continent would drift deeper into a century of dependence rather than a century of self-determination. He began with a stark warning: if African nations continue importing their food, their medicine, their technology, and even their sense of identity, then the continent will remain chained to decisions made elsewhere. For older Americans who remember the cost of depending on foreign oil during the 1970s energy crisis, the parallel was unmistakable. Dependency always comes with a price, and the speaker argued that Africa has been paying that price for far too long. He pointed to the social consequences first. If Africa cannot feed itself, hunger will continue to push families into vulnerability. When nations spend billions importing basic food products, less is left for hospitals, schools, and public works. That gap, in turn, fuels frustration among the youth, a generation that already feels betrayed by leaders who promise much but deliver little. The migration crisis was his next warning. Thousands of young Africans risk their lives crossing the Sahara and the Mediterranean because they believe they have no future at home. I look forward to the day, he said, with a heavy pause, when our young men and women will not die in the Mediterranean Sea. It was a plea rooted in compassion but also in political urgency. When so many of a nation's youth abandon their homeland, democracy weakens, civic participation collapses, and a country loses its most dynamic generation. From the civil, he moved to the political. A continent that relies on foreign powers for food loans, weapons, and data is a continent with limited sovereignty. He reminded the audience of Africa's long history of beautiful declarations: the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Declaration Agenda 2063, all written with hope but rarely implemented. As long as African states depend on external institutions like the IMF, World Bank, or multinational corporations to survive, their political systems will remain vulnerable to pressure and manipulation. Then he circled back to Nigeria, the sleeping giant. If Nigeria fails to lead, the whole region suffers. Instability spreads, markets shrink, smaller nations lose the anchor they depend on. He listed examples where Nigeria's leadership once restored balance, ending apartheid's isolation, stabilizing Liberia, and Sierra Leone intervening in the Gambia. Each instance demonstrated that Nigeria's actions ripple across the continent. Today, however, Nigeria stands uncertain, and the consequences of inaction could be severe. A weakened Nigeria means a weakened West Africa. And a weakened West Africa means a continent unable to negotiate fair terms in trade, unable to manage its natural resources, and unable to protect its people from external interference. This is the political cost of hesitation. But there was also hope in the consequences, a different scenario he urged the audience to embrace. If Nigeria embraces its role, if Ilorin continues producing graduates rooted in African soil rather than foreign imitation, then the political map of Africa could be transformed. Food independence would free nations from debt traps. Cultural confidence would strengthen unity. Technological innovation would give Africa control over its digital infrastructure. And youth who once risked the Mediterranean might instead build empires at home. The speaker made it clear Africa's political future depends not on the promises made in global conferences, but on the decisions made in classrooms, farms, laboratories, and city halls across the continent. The fate of millions rests on whether countries like Nigeria decide to rise or to remain spectators in their own story. From a global perspective, the message delivered at the University of Ilorin does not exist in isolation. It echoes far beyond Nigeria's borders and lands directly in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Moscow capitals that have long understood Africa's strategic importance, even when African leaders themselves doubted their own power. And for an American audience, especially older viewers familiar with the Cold War and America's shifting global alliances, these dynamics feel familiar. Africa is once again becoming the ground on which the future balance of power will be shaped. The United States, whether openly or quietly, watches Africa with a mix of concern and necessity. Africa is not simply a humanitarian issue, it is a geopolitical anchor. The continent holds some of the world's largest reserves of cobalt, lithium, uranium, copper, and rare earth minerals resources, essential for modern weapons systems, electric vehicles, microchips, and advanced batteries. For decades, the U.S. approach to Africa has been defined less by partnership and more by maintaining access, ensuring stability, and countering influence from rival powers. This is why a speech urging African autonomy resonates so deeply and uncomfortably in Washington. When the speaker explains that African digital life runs on American-owned platforms and American-controlled servers, he is highlighting a truth U.S. policymakers know well: whoever controls data controls influence. When he warns that these systems could be switched off at any time, he is revealing the fragility of Africa's dependence on foreign technology. In American strategic circles, this is not dismissed. It is understood as leverage. Europe, too, has its concerns. The European Union depends heavily on African labor markets, migration flows, and raw materials. A rising Africa, one that strengthens its universities, develops its own industries, and reduces dependence on European products, could reshape global trade patterns. Brussels understands this, which is why European leaders often emphasize partnership while quietly attempting to preserve existing economic advantages. Yet, the most dramatic shift is coming from within Africa itself. Countries like Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré and others across the Sahel are openly rejecting long-standing Western models. Whether one agrees with their policies or not, they represent a new assertiveness, a refusal to be passive actors in global geopolitics. This new generation of leaders demands control over mines, digital infrastructure, agriculture, and military strategy, and their rhetoric is changing how Africans view themselves. For the United States, this creates both risk and opportunity. A stable, confident Africa could become a powerful partner in trade, climate cooperation, and global security. But an Africa that feels exploited or disrespected will naturally seek alternatives, whether from Russia, China, or a new Pan-African coalition. Older American viewers who lived through decades of shifting alliances understand what happens when nations feel cornered. They realign. The world is listening because Africa is waking up. Not through war or revolution, but through speeches like this delivered in university halls, not battlefields. It is a reminder that ideas once spoken with conviction often travel farther and last longer than weapons or treaties. And for the first time in generations, Africa is shaping its own conversation, and the world is being forced to respond. As the final words of the speech echoed through the hall at the University of Ilorin, there was a sense that something deeper had occurred. Not just a lecture, not just a celebration of a 50-year milestone, but the sounding of an alarm. A quiet, yet powerful warning. Africa's window of opportunity will not remain open forever. The continent stands at a crossroads, and history has shown again and again that crossroads are not neutral places. They demand a choice. They demand courage. And they punish hesitation. For older Americans watching this unfold from afar, the pattern may feel familiar. They lived through eras when nations rose because they believed in themselves, and eras when nations declined because they trusted others to define their destiny. The message from Ilorin carried that same truth. A continent that does not claim its own future will have its future claimed by others. The speaker made one thing unmistakably clear: the path ahead is not merely political or economic, but profoundly human. If Africa fails to rebuild its educational foundations, fails to reclaim its languages, fails to nurture its own technologies, and feed its own children, then the next generation will inherit not a continent on the rise, but a continent forever waiting for permission to stand. And yet the hope in his message was just as strong as the warning. He spoke of a Nigeria capable of leading of universities, capable of transforming of young Africans, capable of building a future grounded in dignity rather than dependency. He spoke of the day when Africans move freely across their own borders, eat food grown on their own soil, use digital tools built with their own hands, and take pride in their own culture. It was not a fantasy, it was a blueprint. And this moment of awakening is not isolated. Across the Sahel, leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are also challenging old systems and calling for sovereignty rooted in self-respect. These movements together are reshaping the very idea of what Africa can be. For anyone following Africa news, it is becoming clear the continent is entering an age of self-definition. But the question remains, will Africa choose the harder road of independence or the easier road of imitation? And more importantly, will Nigeria rise to meet the height of its calling or allow this historic moment to slip away? If you believe that Africa deserves more than survival, that it deserves self-respect, leadership, and true sovereignty, then this is the moment to pay attention. If you believe voices like Ibrahim Traoré are part of a new chapter for the continent, share this message. Please share this video if you feel you are among the people who see Africa's awakening before the world recognizes it. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, and leave us your thoughts. Is Africa finally ready to lead itself, or will the next generation have to fight this same battle all over again?